She stands in front of a steel door, her hand trembling as she holds a sealed envelope. Inside that prison cell, a man took his last breath 3 hours ago. His final words were not a confession, not a plea for mercy, but a request that no one saw coming. He looked her in the eyes and said her name, not her title, her name. And now she has to decide whether to honor the last wish of a man who destroyed lives. The envelope feels heavier than it should. She tears it open, and the first line makes her freeze. I thought I was ready to read it, but nothing could have prepared her for what came next. Her name is Officer Claire Dawson. She has worked in corrections for 11 years. She has seen violence, manipulation, despair. She learned early on not to get attached, not to let the stories inside those walls follow her home. But this case was different. The prisoner's name was Marcus Hale. Convicted 15 years ago for a crime that shattered 2 families. The trial was brutal. The media called him a monster. And for 15 years he never denied it. He never asked for forgiveness. He just existed in silence, counting down his days. 3 weeks ago, Claire was assigned to his block. It was routine. Check-ins, meal delivery, nothing unusual. But Marcus started talking to her. Not the way inmates usually do, testing boundaries or seeking favors. He spoke to her like he knew her. Like he was waiting for her specifically. At first she ignored it. Then one night during her shift he called her over. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Officer Dawson, I need to ask you something." She should have walked away. But something in his tone stopped her. He told her he was dying. Stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave him weeks, maybe days. And then he said it. "I have one last wish, and I need your help." She told him she couldn't make promises, but he didn't ask for a promise. He asked for a choice. He handed her a letter through the bars. "This is for someone I hurt, someone who deserves to know the truth. I can't send it myself. They'll never open it if it comes from me. But if you deliver it, if you tell them it's important, maybe they'll read it. Maybe it'll change something." She took the letter not because she agreed, but because she didn't know how to refuse a dying man. She told herself she'd decide later. She told herself she'd throw it away if it felt wrong. 2 days later, Marcus Hale was found unresponsive in his cell. The medical team tried to revive him, but it was too late. Claire was there when they pronounced him dead. She watched as they covered his body, as they logged his belongings, as they prepared to notify next of kin. And in her pocket, folded and hidden, was the letter. She could have turned it in. She could have let it disappear into evidence logs. But instead, she went home that night and opened it. And the first line changed everything. The letter was not addressed to a victim. It was addressed to someone named Lily. Claire had never heard that name in any of the case files. She read further. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. Every word felt measured, like Marcus had rewritten it 100 times in his mind before putting it on paper. He wrote about regret, about guilt, about a secret he carried for 15 years. But it wasn't a confession of the crime he was convicted for. It was something else entirely, something that made Claire's hands shake as she read, because the name Lily wasn't random. It was familiar, too familiar. She stayed up all night reading and rereading the letter. By dawn, she made a decision. She would find Lily. She would deliver the letter, not because she owed Marcus anything, but because the words on that page demanded to be heard. She started searching, public records, social media, old case files. It took 3 days, but she found her. Lily Cartwright, 32 years old, living 2 towns over. A schoolteacher, no criminal record, no apparent connection to Marcus Hale, except for one detail that made Claire's stomach drop. Lily's mother had been one of the victims in Marcus's case, and Lily had testified at his trial when she was just 17 years old. Claire drove to Lily's address on a Saturday morning. She rehearsed what she would say a dozen times, but when Lily opened the door, all the words disappeared. Lily looked at her with cautious curiosity. "Can I help you?" Claire introduced herself. She explained that she worked at the prison. She said she had something that belonged to Lily, something left behind by someone who recently passed away. Lily's expression shifted immediately. "If this is about Marcus Hale, I don't want to hear it." She started to close the door, but Claire spoke quickly. "Please, just read it. You don't have to respond. You don't have to do anything. But he wanted you to have this, and I think you need to see it." Lily hesitated. Her hand gripped the edge of the door. Claire could see the conflict in her eyes: anger, fear, curiosity. Finally, Lily took the letter. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She just closed the door. Claire stood there for a moment, unsure if she had done the right thing. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She told herself it was over. She had fulfilled the request. Whatever happened next was out of her hands, but if you think this was the end, you're wrong. 3 days passed with no word from Lily. Claire tried to forget about it, tried to return to her normal routine, but every quiet moment brought her back to that letter, to the weight of Marcus's final words, to the look on Lily's face when she took the envelope. She told herself she had no right to know what happened next. She had played her part. The rest was between Lily and whatever truth that letter contained, but doubt gnawed at her. Had she made things worse? Had she reopened wounds that were finally beginning to heal? Then, on the 4th day, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. When she did, there was silence on the other end. Then a voice, barely above a whisper. "This is Lily. I read it, and I need to know if what he wrote is true." Claire's heart raced. She didn't know what was in that letter beyond the first few lines. Marcus never told her the full contents. He only said it was important, that it would explain things Lily needed to understand. "What did he tell you?" Claire asked carefully. There was a long pause. "He said my mother didn't die the way I thought she did. He said there was someone else there that night. Someone who has been lying for 15 years. The case had been straightforward, or so everyone believed. Marcus Hale broke into a home during a robbery gone wrong. 2 people died. Lily's mother, Susan Cartwright, and a man named David Brennan. The evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's fingerprints, his DNA, witness testimony, placing him near the scene. He was arrested within 48 hours. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Life without parole. Lily had been 17, living with her aunt after her mother's death, trying to process grief and rage in equal measure. She attended every day of the trial. She looked Marcus in the eyes during her victim impact statement and told him he had stolen her future. But now Marcus was claiming something different. Not innocence, Claire realized, but something more complex. She asked Lily if they could meet in person. This wasn't a conversation for phone calls. Lily agreed, and they met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, far from anywhere either of them might be recognized. Lily looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hands wrapped tight around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. She slid a photocopy of the letter across the table. I made a copy before I could talk myself out of it. Read it. Tell me if I'm losing my mind. Claire read carefully. Marcus's words were precise, almost clinical in places, deeply emotional in others. He admitted to being at the house that night. He admitted to the robbery, but he claimed he wasn't alone. He wrote that there was a second person, someone who panicked when Susan came home early, someone who grabbed a weapon and made choices Marcus couldn't stop. He named that person, Detective Robert Linden, the lead investigator on the case, the man who had built the prosecution's entire narrative, the man who testified with absolute certainty about Marcus's guilt, the man who received a commendation for his work on the case. Claire felt the room tilt slightly. She knew Linden by reputation. He had retired 5 years ago, celebrated as one of the department's most decorated officers. She had never worked with him directly, but everyone knew his name. Everyone trusted his record. And now a dead convict was accusing him of murder, of evidence tampering, of sending an innocent man to prison while he walked free. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the desperate lie of a guilty man seeking redemption he didn't deserve. But then Claire kept reading. Marcus provided details, specific details, things that were never in the public record. He described a watch Linden wore that night, a distinctive piece with an engraved back. He described a conversation Lyndon had on the phone, a panicked call to someone Marcus couldn't identify. He described how Lyndon threatened him, told him if he ever spoke about what really happened, he would make sure Marcus never saw daylight again. Lily's voice broke through Claire's thoughts. "Do you believe him?" Claire looked up. She wanted to say no. She wanted to dismiss it as manipulation, as a final act of cruelty from a man with nothing left to lose. But something about the precision of those details bothered her. Something about the way Marcus had waited 15 years, had never filed appeals, had never tried to tell this story before, made her pause. "I don't know," Claire admitted, "but I think we need to find out." Lily leaned forward. "How?" "He's dead. Lyndon is retired and protected. No one is going to investigate a closed case based on a letter from a convicted killer." Claire knew she was right, but she also knew they couldn't just let it go. If there was even a chance Marcus was telling the truth, if there was even a possibility that Lyndon had manipulated evidence, then Susan Cartwright deserved justice, real justice. They started digging quietly. Claire used her access to request old case files, claiming it was for a training review. She was careful, methodical, making sure nothing seemed suspicious. Lily searched through her mother's belongings, boxes she hadn't opened in years, looking for anything that might connect to that night. They met in secret, compared notes, built a timeline. And slowly, cracks began to appear in the official story. Small inconsistencies, a witness statement that changed between the first interview and the trial. Evidence logged at different times than the report indicated. A photograph from the crime scene that showed something in the background, something that was never mentioned in any testimony. Then Lily found something in her mother's things that changed everything. A journal. Susan had been keeping notes in the weeks before her death. Nothing dramatic, just daily observations, thoughts about her work as a social worker, concerns about cases she was handling. But on the last page, dated 2 days before she died, there was an entry that made both women freeze. I confronted him today about what I found. He denied everything, got defensive, almost threatening. I don't know if I should report it officially or try to handle it quietly. I'm scared of what might happen if I push too hard, but I can't let this continue. Those children deserve better. Susan never wrote who she was referring to, but the entry mentioned a case number. Claire ran it through the system. It was a Child Protective Services case. The investigating officer assigned to verify the home environment was Robert Lyndon. The case had been closed with a favorable report. The children were left in the home. 3 months later, one of them ended up in the hospital with injuries that couldn't be explained. The parents were arrested. Lyndon's report was called into question internally, but nothing came of it. He claimed he had been misled, that the parents were skilled manipulators. The case was buried. But what if Susan had discovered something more? What if she had evidence that Lyndon falsified his report, that he took a bribe or simply didn't do his job? What if she threatened to expose him and he panicked? Suddenly the pieces started fitting together in a way that made Claire's blood run cold. Marcus might have been telling the truth. He might have been at that house to rob it, but Lyndon might have been there too for entirely different reasons. And when Susan came home unexpectedly, when she recognized him, when she realized what was happening, Lyndon made a choice. He killed her. He killed David Brennan, who was likely just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then he framed Marcus for everything, knowing a small-time criminal with a record would be an easy target. Claire and Lily sat in silence, the weight of what they had uncovered pressing down on both of them. They had no proof, nothing that would hold up in court. Just a letter from a dead man, a journal entry that was vague at best, and a series of coincidences that might mean nothing. But they both felt it. The truth was there, buried under 15 years of lies and carefully constructed narratives. And now they had to decide what to do with it. "Do we go to the police?" Lily asked. Claire shook her head. "Not yet. If Lyndon still has friends in the department, if he still has influence, we could end up making this worse. We need more. We need something undeniable. But where do we even start?" Claire knew where they had to go next, but the thought made her stomach turn. They needed to talk to someone who knew Lyndon personally, someone who might have seen cracks in his carefully maintained facade. Someone who might have suspected something was wrong all those years ago, but stayed silent. There was only one person who fit that description. Margaret Lyndon, Robert's ex-wife. They had divorced 8 years ago, 3 years after the trial. The split had been quiet, no public drama, but Claire remembered hearing whispers in the department. Margaret had left suddenly, moved to a different state, cut all ties. No one talked about why. Finding her wasn't easy. Margaret had changed her name back to her maiden name, Carter, and scrubbed most of her online presence. But Lily had resources through her work at the school, connections to databases most people couldn't access. After 2 days of searching, they found an address. Margaret Carter, living in a small town 4 hours north, working as a librarian. Claire called the library, asked if she could speak with Margaret about a personal matter. The woman on the phone hesitated, then said Margaret didn't take personal calls at work. Claire left her number anyway, not expecting a response, but that evening her phone rang. Margaret's voice was careful, measured. "You said this was about Robert." Claire chose her words carefully. She explained that she was investigating some inconsistencies in an old case, that she had questions only someone close to Lyndon might be able to answer. There was a long silence. Then Margaret said something that sent chills down Claire's spine. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking. I've been waiting 15 years for this call." They arranged to meet the following weekend. Margaret insisted it had to be at her home, somewhere private where she could speak freely without fear of being overheard. The drive north felt endless. Lily came with her, neither of them speaking much, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might discover. Margaret's house was small, tucked away on a quiet street lined with oak trees. She answered the door before they could knock, as if she had been watching for them. She was in her late 50s, grey hair pulled back, eyes that looked tired but sharp. She gestured them inside without pleasantries. "We don't have much time. Robert still has people who watch out for him. If he finds out I'm talking to you, this conversation never happened." They sat in her living room. Margaret poured coffee with shaking hands. Then she began to talk. She told them about the man she married, the ambitious detective who always seemed one step ahead of everyone else, who closed cases that stumped other investigators, who rose through the ranks faster than anyone expected. She told them about the first time she noticed something was off, a case he worked where evidence mysteriously appeared after the initial search. A witness who changed their story after Robert spoke with them privately, small things that she rationalized away because she loved him, because she trusted him, because admitting the truth would have destroyed everything. Then came the night of Susan Cartwright's murder. Robert came home at 3 in the morning. His clothes were in a garbage bag. He told Margaret there had been an incident, that he had been called to a scene, that evidence had gotten on his clothes, and he needed to dispose of them properly. She believed him at first, but then she noticed the watch was missing. The engraved watch his father had given him, the one he never took off. She asked about it. He snapped at her, told her he lost it, told her to stop asking questions. That was the first time she felt genuine fear in her own home. Margaret watched the trial. She sat in the back of the courtroom watching Marcus Hale, watching the evidence presented, watching her husband testify with absolute confidence. And something didn't sit right. She couldn't articulate it then, couldn't put words to the feeling that gnawed at her. But she started paying attention. She started noticing patterns, cases where Robert was the sole investigator, cases where evidence was found in convenient locations, cases where suspects confessed after hours alone with him. She began keeping notes, documenting dates and details, not sure what she was building but unable to stop. 2 years after the trial, she found the watch. It was hidden in a box in their garage, wrapped in an old shirt, tucked behind paint cans, where she would never have looked if she hadn't been searching for something else. The engraving was still clear on the back, but there was something else too, a small dent on the side, and what looked like a dark stain in the crevices. She took it to a friend who worked in forensics, asked them to test it privately. They were hesitant, but they owed her a favor. The results came back. Blood. human blood. And when they ran it through the database, it matched Susan Cartwright. Margaret's voice broke as she told them what happened next. She confronted Robert. She showed him the watch, showed him the test results, demanded an explanation. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He looked at her with cold, calculating eyes and told her exactly what had happened that night. He had gone to Susan's house to silence her, to make sure she never reported what she had discovered about his falsified reports. Marcus had been there robbing the place, a convenient scapegoat. David Brennan had been collateral damage, wrong place and wrong time. Robert told Margaret that if she ever spoke about it, if she ever tried to expose him, he would destroy her. He had evidence planted that would make her look complicit. He had connections that would ensure she never worked again, and he reminded her that accidents happen to people who make bad decisions. She lived with that knowledge for another year, terrified and trapped. Then one day Robert came home and told her he was done with her. He wanted a divorce. She didn't ask why. She didn't fight it. She took the settlement he offered, changed her name, and disappeared. She took the watch with her. She had kept it all these years, hidden, insurance in case he ever came after her. But she never used it. She told herself it was because she had no proof of where it came from, no chain of custody that would hold up in court. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. She was a coward. She chose her own safety over justice for two innocent people and a man rotting in prison for crimes he didn't fully commit. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Lily sat frozen, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Claire felt rage and pity warring inside her. She wanted to scream at Margaret for staying silent, for letting Marcus die in prison, for letting Lily grow up believing a lie. But she also understood the fear, the impossible choice between truth and survival. Margaret stood up, left the room, and came back with a small wooden box. She opened it and placed the watch on the table. "This is what you need. This is the proof. But you have to promise me something. When you use this, when you expose him, you leave my name out of it. I'll testify if I absolutely have to, but only as a last resort. I can't go back to living in fear." Claire picked up the watch, turned it over in her hands. The engraving read, "To Robert, with pride, Dad." The blood in the crevices had darkened with age, but was still visible under the right light. This was it. This was the physical evidence that could reopen the case, that could force an investigation, that could finally give Marcus the vindication he died seeking. But it also meant going up against a decorated former detective with powerful friends, risking their careers and possibly their safety. Lily looked at Claire. "What do we do now?" Claire met her eyes. "We finish what your mother started. We make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it costs." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Was the watch enough? Would it hold up after 15 years? Could they prove it hadn't been tampered with or planted? And more importantly, were they ready for the war that would come when they accused Robert Linden? Margaret seemed to read her thoughts. "He won't go down quietly. He'll deny everything. He'll claim the watch was stolen, that I'm lying, that you're desperate to create a conspiracy where none exists. He's spent decades building his reputation. People want to believe in heroes, not monsters wearing badges. You're going to need more than physical evidence. You're going to need someone on the inside willing to stand with you." Claire knew exactly who they needed. Captain Sarah Vance. She had joined the department 2 years after Marcus's conviction, which meant she had no personal investment in protecting the original investigation. She had built a reputation for integrity, for not tolerating corruption regardless of who was involved. But approaching her was dangerous. If Vance didn't believe them, if she reported their allegations through official channels before they had ironclad proof, Linden would know they were coming. He would have time to cover his tracks, to discredit them, to make the watch disappear along with any chance of justice. Claire spent 3 days watching Vance, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment. She finally approached her in a parking garage after her shift, when no one else was around. "Captain Vance, I need 5 minutes of your time, off the record. Something that could change everything we think we know about a closed case." Vance studied her with sharp eyes. She could have shut it down immediately, could have ordered Claire to follow proper protocol. Instead, she said, "You have 3 minutes, make them count." Claire laid it out as concisely as possible. The letter from Marcus, the journal entry from Susan, the watch with blood evidence, the pattern of falsified reports. She watched Vance's expression shift from skepticism to intense focus. When she finished, Vance was silent for a long moment. Then she asked the one question Claire had been dreading. "Why bring this to me? Why not go through internal affairs?" Claire took a breath. "Because Lyndon still has friends in this department. Because I don't know who I can trust. Because if this gets buried again, a woman died for nothing, and a man spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't fully commit. And because you're the only person I believe would actually do something about it." Vance's jaw tightened. She looked away, seemed to be wrestling with something. Then she said something that surprised both of them. "I always thought there was something wrong with that case. The evidence was almost too perfect. Every piece fell into place exactly when it needed to, and Lyndon was too confident, too aggressive about shutting down any questions. But he was untouchable back then. The golden boy who could do no wrong. I was too junior to push back, and by the time I had the rank to ask hard questions, the case was ancient history." She turned back to Claire. "Show me the watch." They met the next evening at Vance's house. Lily came too, carrying her mother's journal like a sacred text. Margaret had sent detailed notes about every inconsistency she had documented during her marriage. Every case she suspected was compromised. Vance spent 2 hours reviewing everything, asking pointed questions, challenging their assumptions, playing devil's advocate. Finally, she sat back. "This is enough to warrant a formal investigation. But we need to be strategic. If we move too fast, if we give Lyndon any warning, he'll activate every connection he has. We need to build an airtight case before we make any official moves." Vance had a plan. She would quietly reopen the evidence review on the Cartwright case, citing routine cold case analysis. It would give them legal cover to examine original files, to request forensic retesting, to interview witnesses again without raising immediate red flags. Meanwhile, Claire would use her prison access to review Marcus's visitor logs, phone records, any communication he had in his final months. If he had been gathering evidence himself, if he had documentation beyond the letter, they needed to find it. Lily would continue searching through her mother's belongings, looking for anything that might corroborate Susan's suspicions about Lyndon. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Every search they conducted left a digital trail. Every file they requested was logged. They operated under the assumption that someone loyal to Lyndon might notice their activity and report back to him. So they moved carefully, spacing out their requests, making everything look routine and unconnected. But as they dug deeper, they found more than they expected. They found other cases, other victims, a pattern of corruption that stretched back 20 years. Lyndon hadn't just framed Marcus. He had built an entire career on manipulated evidence and intimidated witnesses. Then they caught a break. Claire found something in Marcus's prison records that everyone had overlooked. 3 months before his death, Marcus had requested access to the prison law library. He had filed a formal request for case documents, claiming he wanted to write a memoir. The request was denied because he had terminal cancer and was not expected to live long enough to complete any appeals. But the denial letter included a notation that Marcus had already received copies of certain documents through his attorney years ago. Documents that should have been in his personal belongings when he died, but they weren't. Claire reviewed the inventory of Marcus's cell. Legal papers were listed, but they were generic forms, nothing substantive. Someone had removed the case documents, either before Marcus died or immediately after. But why? Unless those documents contained something someone didn't want found. Claire filed a request to speak with Marcus's former attorney, a public defender named James Rothman, who had moved to private practice. Rothman was reluctant at first, citing attorney-client privilege, but when Claire explained that his former client had specifically wanted certain information brought to light, that Marcus had died trying to expose corruption, Rothman agreed to meet. Rothman's office was small, cluttered with case files and law books. He looked older than his years, Worn down by decades of fighting losing battles in a system stacked against his clients, he remembered Marcus clearly. Good kid who made bad choices, but he always maintained there was more to the story than what came out at trial. He said someone else was there that night, someone who had the power to make him take the fall. I didn't believe him at first. Thought it was typical defendant denial. But then I started noticing things during discovery. Evidence that appeared after initial searches, witness statements that changed. And when I pushed back, when I filed motions questioning the chain of custody, I got a visit from Lyndon himself. Rothman described the meeting. Lyndon came to his office, ostensibly to discuss the case, to answer questions about his investigation. But the conversation quickly became a threat. Lyndon told him that pursuing conspiracy theories would not only hurt his client, but could damage Rothman's career. He suggested that young public defenders, who got reputations as troublemakers, found it hard to build practices later. He reminded Rothman that cooperation was remembered when people were looking to hire attorneys for better-paying cases. The message was clear. Take the plea deal on the table, convince Marcus to plead guilty, and everyone walks away with their futures intact. But Marcus refused the deal. He insisted on going to trial, insisted on telling his version of events. And he was destroyed on the stand. The prosecution painted him as a liar, a criminal trying to shift blame. The jury didn't believe him. Rothman always wondered if he had failed his client by not fighting harder, by not risking his career to expose what he suspected. Now, 15 years later, he had a chance at redemption. He opened his safe and pulled out a file. I kept copies of everything, every inconsistency I found, every question I couldn't get answered. I told myself it was for appeal purposes, but really I think I knew someday someone would need it. The file was extensive. Photographs of the crime scene that showed details missing from official reports. Notes from an independent forensic expert Rothman had consulted, who questioned the blood splatter patterns. Transcripts of witness interviews where people described seeing two men near the house that night, not just one. And buried in the middle was a sworn affidavit from a witness who had since died, a neighbor who claimed to have seen a police car parked 2 blocks away an hour before the murders occurred. A car that shouldn't have been there, a car the official timeline never mentioned. Claire felt pieces clicking into place. The affidavit was dated 3 weeks before trial, but it was never entered into evidence, never mentioned in court. She asked Rothman why. He explained that the witness recanted the day after giving the statement, claimed she had been mistaken about the time and date. But Rothman never believed the recantation. The woman had seemed terrified when she changed her story, had refused to meet with him again. 2 months later, she died in a car accident, single-vehicle collision on a clear day on a straight road. The police report called it driver error, possibly a medical event. No investigation beyond the routine accident assessment. Lily's voice was barely audible. How many people did he hurt? How many lives did he destroy to protect himself? Vance answered, her voice hard. More than we know. But we're going to find out. And we're going to make sure every single victim gets justice. She turned to Rothman. I need you to go on record with all of this. I need you to testify about the pressure you were under, about the evidence that was suppressed. Rothman nodded. I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask. They had built a case. Not perfect, not complete, but strong enough to demand action. Vance prepared to move forward with formal charges. But first, she needed to secure the watch, get it into proper evidence custody with documentation that would withstand any challenge. Margaret agreed to turn it over, but only if Vance personally guaranteed her safety. Arrangements were made for Margaret to come back to town under protection, to give a formal statement, to hand over the evidence that would finally bring Lyndon down. But the night before Margaret was scheduled to arrive, Claire received a call that made her blood run cold. Margaret's house had burned to the ground. Fire investigators were calling it accidental, a gas leak that ignited. Margaret's body was found inside, burned beyond recognition. The watch was missing, presumed destroyed in the fire, and just like that, their most damning piece of physical evidence was gone. The fire was no accident. They all knew it, but proving it was another matter entirely. Local authorities 4 hours north had no reason to suspect arson. A widowed librarian living alone, An old house with aging infrastructure, a tragic but explainable death. The case was closed within 48 hours. But Claire knew better. Lyndon had found out. Somehow, despite all their precautions, despite their careful movements, he had discovered what they were building against him, and he had acted with the same cold calculation he had used 15 years ago. Vance called an emergency meeting at a location she trusted, a cabin owned by her brother 2 hours outside the city. No phones, no digital communication, nothing that could be traced or intercepted. When they arrived, Vance's expression was grim. "We have a leak. Someone has been feeding information to Lyndon. Every move we've made, every person we've contacted, he's been one step ahead. Margaret's death wasn't random. It was a message. He's telling us he knows, and he's willing to kill to protect himself." Claire felt sick. They had gotten Margaret killed. Their investigation, their pursuit of justice, had put a target on an innocent woman's back. But Lily's reaction surprised them both. She didn't break down. She didn't collapse under the weight of another loss. Instead, her grief transformed into something harder, sharper. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "He thinks he's won. He thinks destroying the watch means we have nothing left. But he's wrong. We still have the documentation, the witness statements, the pattern of corruption, and now we have something else. We have proof that he's still dangerous, still willing to kill. That makes him sloppy. Desperate people make mistakes." Vance studied Lily with new respect. She's right. Lyndon's confidence has kept him safe all these years. But murder in the present day is different from covering up murders from 15 years ago. If we can connect him to Margaret's death, if we can prove he knew she was coming forward, we can use that to crack open the original case. Claire understood the logic, but the risk terrified her. Going after Lyndon now meant painting targets on all of them. But staying silent meant letting him win, meant letting Marcus die without vindication, meant letting Susan's murder go unpunished forever. They needed to draw Lyndon out, force him to make another move they could document and trace. Vance had an idea that was dangerous but potentially brilliant. We go public, not with accusations, not with evidence, but with questions. We leak information to a journalist about inconsistencies in the Cartwright case. We make it look like a routine cold case review has uncovered troubling gaps. We don't mention Lyndon by name, but anyone who worked that case will know where the questions are pointing. And when Lyndon reacts, when he tries to silence us or discredit us, we'll be ready. They chose a journalist carefully, someone with a reputation for integrity, someone who had exposed corruption before, someone Lyndon couldn't easily intimidate or buy off. Her name was Rachel Torres, an investigative reporter who had won awards for her work on police misconduct. Vance reached out through a secure channel, provided just enough information to spark interest without revealing their full hand. Torres was skeptical at first, but agreed to meet after reviewing the preliminary documents. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a busy restaurant where they could hide in plain sight among dozens of other conversations. Torres listened as they walked her through the basics. A convicted killer's dying letter, a victim's journal suggesting she had discovered police corruption, a pattern of evidence that appeared too conveniently, a former wife who had lived in fear and had now died under suspicious circumstances. Torres asked hard questions, pushed back on weak points, demanded documentation for every claim. But by the end, she was convinced enough to pursue the story. The article ran 3 days later. It was carefully worded, presenting the information as questions rather than accusations. Could a 15-year-old murder conviction have been based on compromised evidence? Why were certain witness statements never presented at trial? What happened to documents that should have been in the convicted man's possession when he died? The article never named Lyndon, but it didn't have to. Anyone familiar with the case would recognize the implications. The response was immediate and explosive. The department issued a statement defending the integrity of the original investigation. Former colleagues of Lyndon's appeared on local news, declaring the article was a baseless attack on a dedicated officer's legacy. But there were also other voices, quieter but significant. Former witnesses coming forward saying they had been pressured to change their statements. Other attorneys mentioning cases where Lyndon had seemed too controlling of evidence. Families of defendants claiming their loved ones had been framed. The cracks in Lyndon's perfect reputation were starting to show. And then Lyndon himself called a press conference. He stood before cameras, projecting righteous indignation, and condemned the article as a conspiracy theory designed to undermine law enforcement. He spoke about his decades of service, about the sacrifices he had made, about the dangers of letting criminals manipulate the system even after their deaths. He specifically mentioned Marcus Hale, calling him a manipulative sociopath who had spent his final days trying to create chaos. And then he said something that sent a chill through everyone watching. "I welcome any legitimate investigation into my conduct. I have nothing to hide. My record speaks for itself." But Claire noticed something others might have missed. When Lyndon spoke about Marcus, his hand unconsciously moved to his wrist, to where a watch would normally sit. It was brief, barely a second, but it revealed everything. He was thinking about the watch. He was worried about the watch, which meant he didn't know for certain whether it had been destroyed in the fire. Margaret must have been smarter than they realized. She must have hidden it somewhere else, somewhere Lyndon couldn't find even after killing her. Claire called an emergency meeting. If Margaret hid the watch somewhere safe, if she didn't keep it in her house, then we still have a chance. But where would she have put it? They spent hours theorizing, running through possibilities. A safety deposit box. But banks kept records, and Lyndon could have traced that. A storage unit? Same problem. It had to be somewhere personal, somewhere only someone close to Margaret would think to look. And then Lily remembered something from their conversation with Margaret. She had mentioned her daughter briefly. A single comment about how she wished they could have had a better relationship, but understood why her daughter had distanced herself after the divorce. Margaret had a daughter. They had been so focused on Margaret herself that they never thought to look at her family. Claire tracked down the daughter's information. Her name was Rebecca Carter, 34 years old, living in the same town as her mother, but with virtually no public connection between them. They had maintained separate lives, likely Margaret's way of protecting her daughter from any potential fallout from her secrets. But if Margaret was planning to come forward, if she knew the risks, she might have reached out to her daughter one final time. Finding Rebecca was harder than finding Margaret had been. She had privacy settings on every social media platform, an unlisted phone number, and a general digital footprint that suggested someone who valued anonymity. But Lily used her school connections again, found an old emergency contact form that listed Rebecca's workplace. She was a nurse at a community clinic. They waited until her shift ended, approached her in the parking lot carefully, aware that she might be as frightened and suspicious as her mother had been. Rebecca recognized Claire immediately from news coverage of the press conference. She tried to walk away, but Claire spoke quickly. "Your mother was going to testify against Robert Lyndon. She had evidence that could have changed everything. 2 days before she was supposed to come forward, she died. I don't think that was a coincidence, and I don't think you do either." Rebecca stopped, turned slowly. Her eyes were red, grief still fresh. Then she said something that changed everything. "My mother came to see me 3 days before she died. First time we had really talked in 8 years. She gave me a box, said if anything happened to her, I needed to get it to someone I trusted in law enforcement. She made me promise not to open it, not to look inside, just to keep it safe until the right person asked for it." Rebecca had the watch, not just the watch, but documents, photographs. Recordings Margaret had made of conversations with Robert over the years, when she was still married to him, before she fled. Everything they needed was in that box, preserved and protected by a daughter who had kept her mother's final request, even though she didn't understand it. Rebecca handed over the box with shaking hands. "I knew my father was a bad man. I knew my mother left him because she was afraid. But I never knew what he had done. Now I want to know everything. I want to help you destroy him." They opened the box together in Vance's presence, documenting everything with official procedures that would hold up in court. The watch was there, sealed in a bag with a handwritten note from Margaret explaining where it came from, when she found it, and what the blood evidence represented. But there was more. There were audio recordings of arguments where Robert admitted to planting evidence in other cases. There were copies of financial records showing payments to witnesses. There were photographs of Robert meeting with known criminals in circumstances that had no legitimate explanation. Margaret had been building her own case for years, documenting everything she could, preparing for a day when she might be brave enough to come forward. She had never lived to see that day, but she had ensured her evidence would survive even if she didn't. As they reviewed the materials, as they saw the full scope of Lyndon's corruption laid bare, Claire felt something shift. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. This wasn't just about Susan. This was about dozens of cases, hundreds of lives affected, an entire system corrupted by one man's willingness to do whatever it took to maintain his reputation. Vance made the call to the Attorney General's office. The case was too big, too explosive to handle at the local level. They needed state investigators, people who had no connection to Lyndon, no reason to protect him. Within hours, a task force was assembled. Warrants were issued, and early the next morning, Robert Lyndon was arrested at his home on charges of murder, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The arrest was broadcast live on every local station. The man who had spent decades projecting authority and control was led away in handcuffs, his face betraying shock that his carefully constructed world was finally collapsing. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Every day brought new revelations, new victims coming forward, new evidence of systematic corruption that had infected the department for 2 decades. Prosecutors presented Margaret's recordings, playing them in open court, where everyone could hear Lyndon's voice admitting to planting evidence, threatening witnesses, destroying careers of anyone who questioned his methods. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but the words were unmistakable. Expert witnesses testified about the blood evidence on the watch, confirming it matched Susan Cartwright and that the degradation patterns were consistent with a 15-year timeline. Rebecca testified about her mother's fear, about the years of silence, about the box she had kept safe without understanding its significance. James Rothman took the stand and detailed the pressure campaign Lyndon had waged to secure Marcus's conviction, the evidence that had been suppressed, the witnesses who had mysteriously changed their stories. Other attorneys came forward with similar experiences from different cases. A pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Lyndon hadn't just framed Marcus Hale. He had spent his entire career manipulating the justice system, sending innocent people to prison while letting actual criminals walk free when it served his purposes. The defense tried to discredit the evidence, tried to paint Margaret as a bitter ex-wife with an agenda, tried to suggest the recordings had been doctored, but the sheer volume of corroborating testimony overwhelmed every objection. The forensic evidence from Margaret's house fire came back during the trial. Accelerant had been found in multiple locations, a clear indication of arson. Security footage from a neighbor's camera showed a vehicle matching Lyndon's truck in the area hours before the fire started. Cell phone records placed him near Margaret's town on the day of her death, despite his claims that he had been home all day. The prosecution argued that Margaret's murder was proof of consciousness of guilt, evidence that Lyndon knew his past was catching up to him and was willing to kill again to keep his secrets buried. Claire sat through every day of testimony. She watched Lyndon's facade crack piece by piece as the evidence mounted. The confident, decorated detective was replaced by a desperate man who had run out of places to hide. When the prosecution called Lily to the stand, Claire saw Lyndon's expression change. For the first time, she saw something that might have been shame. Lily spoke about her mother with quiet strength. She described Susan as a woman who fought for children no one else would protect, who refused to look away from injustice even when it put her at risk. She talked about growing up believing Marcus Hale had stolen her future, about the years of anger and grief directed at the wrong person. And she looked directly at Lyndon and said, "You didn't just kill my mother. You killed the truth. You made me hate an innocent man. You stole 15 years of his life and all the years I could have spent knowing my mother died trying to protect children, not randomly murdered in a robbery." The defense rested without calling Lyndon to testify. His attorneys knew he would be destroyed on cross-examination, that every word he spoke would only make things worse. The closing arguments took 2 days. The prosecution methodically connected every piece of evidence, built a timeline that showed premeditation and consciousness of guilt, demonstrated that Lyndon had not only committed the original murders, but had spent 15 years actively covering them up, and had killed again when his crimes were about to be exposed. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was read in a courtroom packed with victims, their families, journalists and officers who had once called Lyndon a hero. Guilty on all counts: murder in the first degree for Susan Cartwright and David Brennan, murder in the first degree for Margaret Carter, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later, but remanded Lyndon to custody immediately. As officers led him away, he looked back at the courtroom. His eyes found Claire's for just a moment. There was no defiance left, no anger, just the hollow recognition of a man who had finally lost everything. Claire felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only exhaustion and a deep sadness for all the lives destroyed by one man's corruption. Sentencing day brought closure for some, though the wounds would never fully heal. The judge delivered a statement that lasted nearly 20 minutes, detailing the scope of Lyndon's crimes and the betrayal of public trust they represented. She sentenced him to life without possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively. Robert Lyndon would die in prison just as Marcus Hale had, but unlike Marcus, Lyndon would die knowing the truth had been exposed, his legacy destroyed, his name forever associated with the corruption he had spent his career hiding. The day after sentencing, Claire and Lily drove to the cemetery where Susan was buried. It had been 15 years since Lily had visited the grave, unable to face the memories, unable to separate her grief from her rage. But now she knelt beside the headstone and spoke to her mother for the first time since childhood. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I didn't know what you were fighting for. But we finished it, Mom. We made sure the truth came out." Claire stood back, giving Lily privacy for her goodbye. When Lily finally stood, tears streaming down her face, she looked lighter somehow, as if a weight she had carried for 15 years had finally been lifted. They drove to another cemetery across town, to a grave that had only recently been marked with a proper headstone. Marcus Hale's body had been buried in a pauper's section, no family to claim him, no one to mark his passing. But Claire and Lily had arranged for a new stone, something simple but dignified. The inscription read Marcus Hale, who died seeking truth and found justice in death. They stood together, two women who had never known Marcus but who had fought for him anyway, who had risked everything to honor his final wish. Lily placed flowers on the grave. "Thank you for the letter. Thank you for not giving up. I wish I could have told you I believed you before it was too late." The case triggered a massive review of Lyndon's entire career. The Attorney General's office established a task force to examine every conviction he had been involved with, every case he had investigated, every piece of evidence he had handled. Dozens of cases were reopened. Several convictions were overturned. Men and women who had spent years in prison for crimes they didn't commit were finally exonerated. It would take years to fully unravel the damage Lyndon had caused, but the process had begun. The department implemented new oversight procedures, new requirements for evidence handling, new protections for officers who reported misconduct. None of it would bring back the lost years, but it might prevent future tragedies. Claire received a commendation for her role in exposing the corruption, but she turned down the ceremony. She didn't want recognition for doing what should have been done 15 years ago. Captain Vance was promoted to chief, tasked with rebuilding trust in a department that had been fundamentally damaged by one of its own. Rebecca Carter used her mother's story to advocate for victims of domestic violence and institutional corruption, turning her family's tragedy into a force for change. And Lily returned to her work as a teacher, carrying her mother's legacy of protecting children and fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. 6 months after the trial, Claire received a letter from James Rothman. Inside was a photograph he had found in Marcus's old case files, something that had been overlooked in the evidence. It showed Marcus as a young man, maybe 20 years old, smiling beside an older couple. On the back in faded ink was written Marcus with his parents summer before everything changed. Claire looked at the photo for a long time, seeing not the convicted criminal from news reports, not the dying prisoner from the hospital bed, but a person. Someone who had made mistakes, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who had been used and discarded by a system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. She added the photo to a folder she had been keeping, documenting the case, preserving the story of how justice had been delayed but not ultimately denied. Late one night, unable to sleep, Claire found herself thinking about the letter that had started everything. Marcus's final wish had been simple. He wanted the truth to reach someone who deserved it. He wanted Lily to know that her mother hadn't died randomly, that Susan's death had meaning beyond senseless violence. He had spent 15 years carrying that knowledge, protecting that truth, waiting for a moment when he could safely release it. And in his final days, facing death with nothing left to lose, he had taken the chance. He had trusted a prison guard he barely knew to do what he couldn't do himself. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. The case taught Claire something about justice that she had never fully understood before. It's not clean. It's not simple. It doesn't always arrive when you want it or in the form you expect. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it requires people to risk everything with no guarantee of success. Sometimes the people who deserve vindication never live to see it. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth having. Marcus never knew his letter would lead to Lyndon's arrest. He died believing he had failed, believing his last attempt at redemption had fallen on deaf ears. But his words had planted a seed, started a process that grew beyond anything he could have imagined. His death had meaning, because people chose to give it meaning, because they refused to let his final truth die with him. Lily started a foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to supporting families of victims whose cases involved police misconduct. She spoke at schools, at community centers, anywhere people would listen, about the importance of questioning authority when something doesn't feel right, about the courage it takes to stand up against corruption even when the odds seem impossible. She told Marcus's story, gave him the recognition he never received in life, made sure people understood that he had been more than his worst mistake, that he had tried to do the right thing when it mattered most. And sometimes late at night when the world was quiet, Claire would read Marcus's letter again. The words never changed, but their meaning deepened each time. I can't undo what I did. I can't bring back the time I lost or repair the damage I caused. But I can tell the truth. I can make sure someone knows what really happened. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe it doesn't balance the scales. But it's all I have left to give. And I'm giving it to you because I believe you deserve better than the lies you've been told. You deserve to know your mother died fighting for something that mattered. She died being brave. And that's a legacy worth remembering. The letter had changed everything. It had exposed corruption, freed innocent people, brought a killer to justice, and given a daughter back the truth about her mother. But more than that, it had proven something fundamental about the human need for truth. Even when we're broken, even when we've failed, even when redemption seems impossible, we still reach for it. We still try to make things right. We still hope that somewhere, someone will hear our words and choose to believe them. Marcus Hale had died in prison, his name forever marked by conviction, but his final act had been one of courage and selflessness, and in the end, that mattered more than anything else. What last wish would you fulfill if you knew the truth could change everything? What letter would you write if you had one final chance to make things right? Think about the Marcus Hales in your own life, the people whose stories never got told, whose truths got buried under convenient narratives, and ask yourself whether you'd have the courage to do what Claire did, to risk everything for justice you might never see. Leave your thoughts below. Because sometimes the most important stories are the ones no one wanted us to hear.